Hi, everybody, and welcome to another great episode of the Infrastructure as Code podcast. My name is Ohad Maislich, and today we have an amazing guest coming from PagerDuty, Mandi Walls. Hi, Mandy. How are you?
I'm all right, Ohad. How are you?
I'm doing well. Actually, today the recording is done on January 10th, which is a very, very happy day for the open source community. We are involved in Open Tofu, the
Yeah.
open source fork of Terraform. And today we just announced a couple of hours ago the GA version of Open Tofu. So it's now production ready. So today I'm very, very excited about what's going on with the Linux Foundation and CNCF and OpenTofu and the future of infrastructure as code.
Yeah,
How are
that's
you doing
super
today?
exciting. I was seeing folks like put out their first PRs and information
Uh,
about that, and there's some webinars and stuff coming from various places. So super excited to see where that project gets to.
Definitely. Thank you. Thank you. Eh, For those who are not aware of PagerDuty, can you say a few words on what is PagerDuty?
Yeah, it does what it says on the tin, right? Like it started out as a incident response, incident management sort of platform. It's the thing that's going to wake you up in the middle of the night when your stuff isn't working the way it's supposed to. Since then, we've expanded a bit more. We also have some automation products and some other things that we're working on. But that's what we're most known for is the thing
Waking
that
you up.
wakes you up. Yep. Don't hate the pager, hate the
I
game. It's okay.
I had the honor of being called in the middle of the night a few times. Sometimes even need to drive to the
Those
office
are the
to
worst
restart
days. Yeah.
the server, physical server that was down. So yeah, I remember that day. It was heavily raining.
Of course,
Yeah,
always. Yeah. The worst weather.
cool. And your background besides that is you've done a lot of things in chef, right?
Yeah, before I joined PagerDuty in 2020, I spent 8.5 years at Chef. So I was like employee 51 or 52 at Chef. So it's been a lot of time there doing, at the beginning, everything, but then professional services and community stuff there at the end. So spent a lot of time working with the Chef community and our customers there and helping them with their infrastructure as code journeys at that time. So, yeah.
So let's talk about the infrastructure as code journey, as you've seen a very important phase of that journey while working at Chef.
Yeah.
I remember Chef and Puppet and Ansible, all of those really changed the way that DevOps engineers work. Can you share about what you've seen and how you see the next, or like the past, the present, and the future, starting with your background in Chef?
Yeah. So actually, before I joined Chef, I was a systems administrator for large web properties at AOL. So I came in from the operations side, and at that time, so we're talking 20 years ago now, right? Oh my gosh! But like everything you had to manage your systems with is probably homegrown. It was a bunch of, in our case, Bash scripts, and we had one weird SA who wrote his stuff in like C shell, but like he was the only one doing that, and you were maintaining these things in very awkward ways, and there'd be like a directory on all the hosts that had these shell scripts in them, and they'd be named like use this.sh or don't use this.sh underscore bak and like crazy stuff like that. And Chef and Puppet came on the scene, and CF Engine had been there for a while, but I think we gained more interest in it as Chef and Puppet got bigger because you could do things a little bit more rationally and they'd be a little bit more portable. You had more of a common language rather than my bash scripts and your bash scripts, and they're trying to work together. And you then had this common component you could work around via the chef recipes and puppet modules and all that kind of stuff. Do a little bit better job of sharing those things around so that if I wrote a Tomcat package, you could use it without a whole lot of strife and trouble. And some folks got there, some folks didn't. When I joined Chef, like a lot of our initial work was sort of bringing folks along that journey to try and say, you don't have to keep all these bash scripts and all this old stuff around. It's okay. Like it's going to be a little bit more
Mm,
flexible for you to take this journey and get into some of these new practices. And for a lot of folks, it was completely different. Not only because, I think a lot of folks internalize the idea that writing bash isn't really coding, and bash is its own esoteric thing. It's very much coding. But for folks to then step from that into say Ruby, which is what Chef was built in, Like that's a that's a big step for a lot of folks to take. So we did a lot of like Ruby training, right? And we had a module, just enough Ruby for Chef, so that folks would be more comfortable operating in the environment to get what they needed to do because they were used to for loops and things like that in Bash and how does that work in Ruby. Keep those things in mind. And yeah, like a lot of folks hadn't really sat down to think about sort of in the abstract how you want to manage your infrastructure, how you want to manage these environments in a way that's going to help you going forward. Because at the same time, like everything is expanding, and some of the places we worked were going from just a few little systems that were there to run the main web page to like all of a sudden you've got a mobile app and like all this other stuff. People were managing their accounts online, especially in things like financial services and like insurance, where everything had been face to face. You go to talk to your insurance agent, and now you're doing everything online, and that stuff had to come from somewhere. And the folks that were running all that stuff had no idea what they were going to do because we had never done it before. So there was it was a huge learning curve for a lot of folks. And we tried to make Chef in particular as easily approachable as possible. We try to be as friendly as possible because like part of this is I have to say trauma for a lot of folks. Like it was a definite shift to the way they were doing their jobs and maybe things that they hadn't anticipated having to know. And it was a whole journey. And some folks are still on it. So good luck to all of them as
Yeah,
well.
I couldn't agree more. I think the journey is to become more and more a developer,
Mm-hmm.
or the balance between doing programming and operations. You
Yes.
know, I remember back then, 24 years ago, if I may say, I remember you have those that only know how to click a button
Mm-hmm.
or to put the cables in the router and the switches and things like that. Then they started doing bash scripts and PowerShell and VB scripts and whatever you can find in different platforms, and they became more and more professional in
Yeah.
programming. As you mentioned, Ruby is another phase of automation, and I think this started to gradually, uh, to see less clicks
Mm-hmm.
and more code being written. You've mentioned Tomcat, for those who are not aware, Tomcat for Java applications. This is, Chef configuration management really helping configuring the application, because
Yeah.
the infrastructure back then I think was pretty simple with a monolith. So you needed one virtual machine or physical server
Yeah.
that runs Tomcat and one SQL database, and that was basically your app. But nowadays with cloud native and microservices, the applications became way more complicated.
Yeah.
So configuration management is not enough, and then you have infrastructure as code, multi-cloud Terraform or Pulumi or Crossplane or OpenTofu, and cloud specific like CloudFormation and ARM templates. How do you see the combination of using something like Chef and configuration management and infrastructure as code, such as OpenTofu, Terraform, CloudFormation? How do you see the engineers today handling both technologies?
Yeah, I think we're at the point in the evolution where fewer folks are bringing their chef and puppet stuff forward into their new environments. Like I think we're at a point where Terraform and Plumi and some of these other components are working better in the cloud native environment than what chef and puppet were sort of built for, because were they were both like basically built pre-cloud, right? Like it's kind of got it started there in a time where we're still managing VMs mostly, right? In a lot of these places, and coming up into, even when we got to containers, the first level, we're kind of struggling with what does that look like for something like Chef, and how do you actually apply that? Do you need to, if all you're doing is building a container that you're just going to keep rebuilding when you need to anyhow? So I think for most folks, in larger environments, you probably still have that monolith running somewhere. Like PagerDuty does. Some of our stuff is still in the monolith, and as it continues to devolve, fewer and fewer things get managed with the older tools, and more things move forward. And I think too, where some of the shortcomings were in the older environments is like you are still dependent on other expertise for managing the other things that you need. Like you can manage at the VM level, and it was always a struggle to get drivers or libraries or whatever you want to call it to manage the other software as a service pieces, the like storage as a service and network as a service, like those components, and have that be a really strong part of what you're managing. And now, as we see for folks who are managing all this stuff with Terraform, it's just one more stanza in your module. It's just one more component that you're adding for all of the things that you need there. And it's a lot harder in the last generation of tools to get all that stuff supported well.
Perfect. Let's talk more about that. So you see your customers and the DevOps and SRE engineers uh, having more and more responsibility
Yeah.
and aware and becoming professionals in more and more frameworks, tools, and solutions. And your goal as a incident management is to reduce the number of incidents.
Yeah.
Now, so I want to switch and talk about confidence and governance. So let's say I'm an organization and a customer of PagerDuty, and I obviously want to reduce the number of incidents. And I'm using infrastructure as code, I'm using, let's say, Terraform. What do you see that your customers are doing in order to reduce the number of incidents? What kind of policy mechanisms do you see nowadays that those engineers are doing? And did it change somewhat due to the fact that they're using less clicks and more code?
I think there's an evolution there because like what we see with the folks who are most successful in like managing their production environments isn't really any different than it ever was. Like the more testing you have, the more abilities you have to do good integrations and that stuff before that your code gets to production are going to help you more just right off the bat. And we see a lot of folks have had to put some resources into maturing that part of their process to manage what happens when they get into production. So that's, of course, part of your first steps there. The next pieces come into sort of maturation around what you're actually seeing in your code in production. And part of that is going to be getting better at dealing with your telemetry out of your cloud environment. Part of that is also looking at, what are your customers seeing versus what you actually see in the system. Because those might be two different things, right? Your customers might have an experience that's very degraded, even though most of your telemetry says things are all right. Because there's some other thing that you're not even looking at that that you're not seeing. So we see a lot of folks have to sort of refocus, right, and get a different lens on their production environments as you're moving into this more complex system, especially for microservices, where as we look at the evolution of like things like observability and tracing and all that kind of stuff, the whole customer experience across lots of different microservices is completely different than what it was when you're in the monolith and everybody knows where all the code is going. And so having sort of better telemetry across all of your resources is a place where we find folks are starting to they start out with a struggle, right? Like what do I need to know out of these components because you haven't had to monitor them in the past. So yeah, that we see folks like start out with a lot more alerts than they need and then pick out the ones that actually impact the customer and say, oh, this one is what we need. This is the one that's going to tell us if there's a problem here.
Yeah, so yeah, eventually whatever you do, you're gonna have those incidents and you can
They
handle
always
those
happen. That's true.
manually. It always happens. You can handle those manually, or you can have a more efficient, automated process
Yep.
about reducing the mean time to recover, the MTTR, and other important metrics to your eventually your customers. That's the most important thing to think about. Uh, we want to talk more about automation and how PagerDuty is doing around that, or maybe this is related to Rundeck. I think it's a company you acquired as PagerDuty. What do you think about automation and incidents?
Yeah, this is where lots of exciting work is going on. Like you said, we PagerDuty acquired Rundeck in late 2020, and for folks who have been in like the sort of DevOps SRE space for a while, maybe you've heard of Rundeck. They've been around for years as an independent project, but it's an automation platform that allows you to sort of export, delegate. Kinds of jobs to other people. So my, cloud engineers can give my application engineers access to things that they wouldn't necessarily have access to, know how to run. So you can automate all kinds of stuff in the Rundeck platform, and we've been taking advantage of that on the PagerDuty side, because like you say, like there is lots of opportunity when you know what an incident is, you know what an alert looks like, and it appears a lot. Like there's less and less need to have a human being involved in that. So we took a look at some of our alerts a couple of years ago and like, okay, well, look, some significant amount of them are page a human and then they're resolved in under 5 minutes, and that's not deep, like what's going on, deep troubleshooting, that kind of, it's like somebody either knows what's going on there and can fix it, or they're ignoring it. So if they know what's going on there and they can fix it, that should be automated. You should never have that human being involved in that at all. You are wasting their time. So we're
You're wasting their time, and you're also uh, you know adding risks
absolutely, because they could do
to
something
your
wrong
own
when they're in there.
processes.
Yeah, totally.
Mhm.
So, like you say, to reduce those risks, reduce the likelihood of a mistake or something being mistyped, or you put the command in the wrong window, or any of those other things that human beings tend to do when they're under stress.
I've never done any of those.
Never accidentally done something as root that you shouldn't have, or anything like that. Um, to minimize all those things, you want more
I'm
automation.
embarrassed. I'm embarrassed in some of the things I've done in the past, but
We all have,
that's
man,
that's
right?
another topic.
We all have. So yeah, you want automation there to make sure that you don't put your 3 a.m. human brain in front of an alert that really could just be done by some code there. So yeah,
We talk about automation and less manual clicks, and it feels like it goes beyond just infrastructure and managing your AWS or Azure.
yeah,
I think PagerDuty, as an example, like many other SaaS vendors, uh, have their own Terraform provider in order to manage, configure, and use basically your solution in a different approach compared to the classic approach
yeah.
of just clicking a button. Can you share about how your users are actually using your product?
Yeah, what we've seen with our biggest accounts is that you see this sort of separation of duties that you see in other places that are sort of embracing sort of platform engineering and SRE mindsets, where you've got some folks who are going deep on those infrastructure components, whether it's your cloud and the other things you're dependent on, your monitoring, your metrics, all that stuff. And they are sort of independent of your application engineers who are writing application code. And like looking at the number of modules and stuff that are currently available in Terraform is astounding. Like there's just so many things in there that you wouldn't have necessarily thought about when Terraform was first launched. That, oh, that's, you could totally, but if you've got an API in front of it, you can manage it with Terraform. So that's our approach to it. We have an API for our there's a REST API for the components in your PagerDuty account, your schedules, your people, your teams, all that stuff, and then that has a Terraform provider in front of it. And our biggest accounts, when they've got hundreds of teams and thousands of services and all this stuff going on, you don't want to manage any of that by hand. Like that is just an enormous job of trying to put all that
It
stuff
doesn't
together.
scale.
It does not scale.
It doesn't.
Absolutely does not scale. And even trying to build your own stuff against our API, that's a lot of resources to put together too. And then to think about dedicating that same work to n number of other SaaS components you might have in your environment, it's like you need two or three whole teams to do that. So Terraform provides us, fortunately, with like a lingua franca across all of the sort of secondary SaaS components in your that are still, I still think of them as infrastructure. Like it's not the CPUs and the network that your applications are running on, but
Your production.
they're
It's
still
your
part of the
production.
production
It's part of your
environment. And so
yeah.
approaching all of them with the same tooling, right? Your same screwdriver that you work on everything else with, has really helped some of our largest customers keep all of their stuff, working well in PagerDuty. So yeah, we have a full time developer who maintains that for us now. So super important.
This is the Infrastructure as Code podcast, but my day job is CEO of NF0. I usually don't mention much about NF0 in this podcast, but I just want to say, our one-liner is really related to what you just said. NF0 is managing infrastructure as code at scale with confidence. So that's pretty much what you've just
Yeah.
described. on how your customers are using infrastructure in their organizations. Super interesting, your background from Chef and PagerDuty and working with infrastructure folks and their ongoing challenges uh, and new technologies that they need to learn
Yeah.
and unlock the full potential of what's going on there is fascinating. Mandi, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a true pleasure, and thank you everybody for listening to another episode of the Infrastructure as Code podcast. Have a great day, everybody. Bye bye.
Thank you.